So, buongiorno, finally back after a somewhat cantankerous, is cantankerous the right word? Hiatus, and putting out these videos, that he really has no legitimate excuse for, except for the fact that life has a tendency to get into the way, and everything that was going on, and trying to get up on a new book that we've never really done in this class before, evaluating media bias, and numerous and sundry other speed bumps and detours and forays into the abyss. But I am back, and I'm better than ever. Back in black. No, not in black, but better than ever. And we will proceed. We're going to start to embark upon Adam Schiffer's book, Evaluating Media Bias, Professor Adam Schiffer from Texas Christian University. And we're taking this detour now out of the Hansen book due to the fact that I think we need a break from the Hansen book, and it's a good time for a break from the Hansen book. We will get back to the Hansen book and cover the necessary material in order to have a more robust understanding of mass media. But I think it behooves us. I guess that's the correct word. I think it behooves us to avail ourselves of a piece of scholarly work that's actually pretty accessible. It's like if for those of you who have started reading chapters 1 and 2, which I put up as a PDF, it's a little bit of a grind, but he's very, very clear. He's very, very straightforward about this whole process of what he is going to do and what is the goal of the book, you know. And that's the question we were going to pose today, and we're going to start unpacking what his goals are in the book and start defining some of his terms that we need to be ready for. But before we embark upon that, let's get into the bullet points. Bullet points. Evaluating Media Bias, chapters 1 and 2 are now on Blackboard, I believe. They should be on Blackboard. If they're not on Blackboard as of the time of this lecture, they will be on Blackboard. But however, they were also sent out to you as a PDF. You need to check your emails, folks. I know that you are getting slammed with emails, all right, from all and sundry. Other profs, you know, the dark tower of student affairs, COVID-19 updates, all and sundry, all these voices, this cacophony of technocratic nonsense. Did I just say that? Vying for your attention. However, you have to recognize the fact that you need to keep an eye out for anything that says COM 100 or anything that is a combined email of COM 100 and COM 200, because a lot of the essential course materials come via email, you know, and that includes things like sending back test grades, and that includes things like, because I'm not sold on Blackboard as being the all-purpose go-to pedagogical utopia that the creators of Blackboard and those and the people that, you know, have created a revenue stream from Blackboard would like us to believe it is. You know, I find that some of the bells and whistles on Blackboard are more like, what's the opposite of bells and whistles? They're just more like a real technocratic drag, you know, and should be avoided, you know, like it should be avoided like super spreader events. We should look at Blackboard. I know I'm going out on a limb here, but I think we should look at Blackboard as like this digital super spreader event of nonsense. All right, And then we need to find ways of getting under Blackboard and around Blackboard, and utilizing Blackboard when it becomes time to utilize Blackboard for the things that it's good for, which are there's about three. There's about three things. But needless to say, you need to be checking your emails too, along with Blackboard. As far as media scans, you can find it in the discussion section of Blackboard. You will find the media scan guidelines, and some of you are running a little late with the media scans. Those need to get up, and also the media scan schedule. It's there, all right, as a Word doc. So those of you who need to get up on media scans should do so post haste, as they say, post haste. So let's get it with it there. Quiz number 2. I'm looking at the calendar, and I'm looking at the fact that we've got this week, and then we've got a short week next week, and so I'm thinking, regardless of what the syllabus says, the syllabus cannot be trusted. All right, it was made by it was created by this conspiracy QAnon. They forced me to here's what you're gonna teach, with a gun to my head, and I'm rebelling. I'm rebelling from that, But having said that, I'm moving the quiz back to the Tuesday that we get back from Thanksgiving, which I'm sure a lot of you will not be angry about or distressed about. And that quiz is probably going to be kind of like the last quiz you received, but this one is probably going to be the content of that quiz is probably going to include the last 2 chapters of the Hansen book we did and a few questions on the book we're doing now, Evaluating Media Bias. I promise you that those questions will not be difficult questions if you've read the material. All right, I'm not out to stump you. I'm not out to throw all kinds of weird unanswerable questions your way. They would be very, very basic questions that if you've read the book at all, you'll get. All right, so there's all that. So, having said that, I hope everybody's doing well. The Schiffer book, I read the Schiffer book during the summer, and here's the way the story goes. Last semester in mass media research, there was a student that was supposed to read this. Every student in that course got a book to read, all right, and they got to pick from this list of books that were relevant to our times, and somebody was assigned this book, and then I got it out for them from interlibrary loan, and they never got it, they never did it, and I went in the library, and they were like, hey, you got an ILL here, and I was like, oh, what is it? And I picked up this book, and I was like, hey, this is actually something that I haven't read, and I think I should read it, and which started an engagement with this book over the summer that kind of opened my eyes a little bit and, provided some really, really important information about journalism, about what we conceive of as being journalism, and the history of some of these ideas that started to spring up like dandelions or milkweed, depending on where you live, that became factual. How these somewhat mythological ideas that we hold in such high esteem nowadays as being these undisputable truths really didn't start as truths at all. They kind of became truths due to people saying it over and over again, all right? Very not unlike the pedagogical process fictionalized in the book 1984 by George Orwell, in which things become true in that book, in that dystopian world of Oceania. One of the ways of controlling the masses was to just kind of tell them, if you tell somebody a lie for long enough, and you hit them over the head with it for long enough, guess what, folks? Sooner or later, you start to think, oh, well, okay, yeah, as opposed to, no, this is bullshit, so that there was this historical process of transforming bullshit into data, into empirical evidence, into facts, and we have to talk a little bit about the history of that process, all right, of transformation. And Schiffer does a fairly astute job at doing this, Starts off chapter 1, after he goes through all the thank yous and acknowledgments, he starts chapter 1 with a quote from the inestimable funny guy and former senator, Al Franken, who I remember from Saturday Night Live back in the day, the old Franken and Davis team. They used to just do these hilarious things. But this, we're more indoctrinated, used to celebrities from the right, coming up into politics, but Franken was more of a celebrity, kind of leaning toward the left, and Schiffer quotes him here, and the quote is as follows. I'm going to open back up here. The quote is as follows. Franken says, asking whether there is a liberal or conservative bias to the mainstream media is a little like asking whether Al-Qaeda uses too much oil in their hummus. I love hummus, by the way. Do you? It's great. Especially when you get it on pita bread. But you gotta get the sprouts, the bean sprouts. Here's the thing. I used to make this homemade hummus. It was this is another story for another time. If you want my hummus recipe, just ask me. It's the best. It's a little like asking whether Al-Qaeda uses too much oil in their hummus. The problem with Al-Qaeda is that they're trying to kill us, all right? So what is Franken trying to say, and why does Schiffer start the book with this, all right? We'll get to that, all right? It's what's Franken trying to say in a nutshell? It's we're worried about certain idiosyncrasies or certain aspects of media that may or may not actually have a important bearing on how it affects our lives. All right? That the things that people generally are concerned with when it comes to the media tend to be more of what Schiffer would call talking points as opposed to real substantive critiques of what the media is, and what the media should be doing. All right. Hence, we'll get into this whole idea of this so-called liberal bias of the media, where this idea got started, who started it, how was it disseminated, and is it true or not? All right. Because one has to pose the question, because certainly Schiffer is going to address it in a way in which he is going to say, there's evidence on both sides, but let's sift through it. All right, let's do some research and let's figure out if there is this overwhelmingly, beyond a reasonable doubt, left-leaning to every mainstream news outlet and creation, all right, and other ones, all right. It becomes a question of asking the right questions, all right, and operationalizing the right terms. What do I mean by operationalize? When you operationalize a term, you come up with the correct definition for that term in order to build your argument, all right? It's like in order for me, for instance, to do, this is a stupid metaphor, but it's like, say that I was teaching a course on like home improvement, you know, we would have to start, we would all have to have some consensual agreement of like what I meant when I said a circular saw or a staircase, you know, or putting up, framing, how to frame a house, what a 2x4 was. We would have to be able to come to some consensual agreement of what I meant when I was referring to these things that we could all kind of agree upon as being a working definition that we could all agree upon. That's all operationalizing is. When you operationalize a term in your paper, you are going out of your way to define that term in a way that makes sense to all of your readers, so everybody like kind of gets it. All right, and this is what we're going to get into here. He starts off with every Saturday morning during the fall academic semester, ESPN would put on a show called Game Day. Some of you sports guys are probably, and ladies, some of you sports people are probably conversant with this. Game Day on Saturday mornings when they would have commentators like wherever. Like if Notre Dame was playing Clemson or if Army was playing Navy, they would have people. And the fans would be behind them with signs. You know, and most of the signs were things like, you know, Notre Dame, blah, 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 or Clemson is blah, blah, blah. It was, you know, the usual, like, tailgating, name-calling hijinks, you know. But, he says, amid a flurry of vicious football taunts, such as Notre Dame players drink pumpkin spice lattes, a large sign could be seen clearly from near the front of the student crowd that said, "Don't believe the liberal media." Why would some Clemson student, staff member, or neighbor in what is likely his or her only national television exposure ever choosing to accuse the mainstream news media of favoring one side of the political spectrum? To those who prefer their team sports to be actual sports, this might have seemed peculiar. But anyone immersed in the game of American politics understands why this game day interloper spent her 15 minutes of fame. If you ever heard that expression before, it was coined by a guy by the name of Andy Warhol. Everybody has 15 minutes of fame. It's kind of like a meme. It was like an old school meme. Accusing the news media of political bias. People feel really strongly about this issue. Accusations of media bias are everywhere. When comedian and future Senator Al Franken ridiculed them in 2003 with the above quip, remember the Al-Qaeda one? Bias charges had just begun to resurge in popular discourse thanks to former CBS reporter Bernard Goldbook's 2001 book called Bias. All right? And to the newly dominant Fox News channel, which around 2003 had kind of become the big dog in the pound. All right? And we have to understand, you know, once again, we're back into media ownership, media consolidation, media conglomeration. And we have to understand that the owner and founder of Fox News, one Rupert Murdoch, was somebody who, at least on a personal level, and certainly, you know, certainly in his own ideological leanings, leaned to the right, strongly to the right, and all of his media organs meaning, you know, for instance, he recently bought a lot of different newspapers, including the New York Post and other ones, and the San Francisco Examiner, I believe, a lot of things, and on top of that, Fox News. All right, so that Fox News became its style, its overall framework in terms of political ideology had to do with conservative, Republican, right-leaning values, and it became a disseminator of those values. And we'll get into why that and why it became so dominant and why it became so wildly popular. All right, because nothing just happens in a vacuum. All right, there's a history of how things come to ascendancy and what they are a response to. Okay, so he goes on. Since then, the intensity and apparent influence of the partisan bias charge has not wavered despite a fast-changing media landscape. It is likely the most commonly held view about the news media. This whole idea of like the liberal media is probably one of the... When anybody says anything about the media that is an analysis of it, the most common invective or criticism that is hailed at the mainstream media is that it has this inherent liberal bias to it, all right? We need to talk about that, all right? It is often the most strongly held or even the only attitude toward the press that a politically aware student brings to class or that an uncle brings to the Thanksgiving table, and we all know those guys, right? Or your social media feed, right? Talk radio hosts, bloggers, and Fox News obsess over it. And several interest groups are devoted entirely to exposing it, including the highly influential Media Research Center. Let's get back to Thanksgiving dinner for a minute, all right? And how we deal with like Thanksgiving, interlopers that want to like shift the subject from stuffing, whether they want to have yams or meat and potato stuffing, or whether they want to have cranberry sauce, into the realm of politics and tend to ruin everybody's day therefrom. All right. Here's my personal strategy in dealing with certain cousins and nephews and uncles that want to argue with Bongiorno or pick Bongiorno's head or engage in verbal melee with moi over Thanksgiving victuals or over Christmas victuals, And my response nowadays to said people is this: I get paid to study and go through and aggregate and work through different issues that have to do with the media, all right? I happen to have 2 advanced degrees in said thing, and this is what I do for a living, right? You pay for the tuition, you come in, it's like, I do all this like prep work to espouse it upon you, what I've been able to gather as a specialist in this field, all right? Having said that, said uncle and cousin and or second cousin twice removed, right, want me to sit at said Thanksgiving table and work, all right, and do work, all right? I don't work for free, friends, And my pat response nowadays is to those people that want to kind of rope me in to doing side work on the side and having to engage them with whatever and having to like educate them. I'm just like, hey, you want to know my opinion about something? Take my class, pay the tuition. It was like my father. My father was a plaster mason. He was a bricklayer. It's like you never asked him to come and plaster your house or do your stairs or re-brick your stairs for free. It's like you don't get me for free either. All right? It's like you guys can like do this little among you amateurs, all right? Amateurs. And leave the actual cognition and thinking to the big people, all right? The big people that do it for a living, I don't work for free. Don't work for free. So that's my response. So that's how I deal with Thanksgiving and Christmas nowadays. I know I've become like an ornery old goat when it comes to stuff like that, but it's very true. And it's a good way. It's like, You should become college professors too, so you can use the exact same deflection points. Just to be able to sit and enjoy your drumstick without having to get into a bunch of nonsense. All right, about how Trump won the election, or how QAnon is something, or how raising the minimum wage is going to hurt the economy. When you're a professor, you don't have to get into any of that pablum if you don't want to. You can just sit there and eat your food unassailed, all right? Because you shouldn't be assailed. All right, so let's get back to this. Influential, MRC. He'll make many references to this media research group. There was basically a right-wing think tank that started to, and he will say that they were a fairly reputable right-leaning think tank that became, whose function was to detect instances of liberal media bias and to call it out in the mainstream media or in the independent media or internet media or whatever. All right. And he says about these, and he says the Media Research Center, which produced the sign seen on game day, they were part of that. All right. The MRC was part of paying somebody off to hold instead of holding a sign that said Clemson sucks or whatever. The MRC paid a kid to hold a sign that called out the liberal media. All right, he was paid. All right, which produced this. Okay, it's also made a prominent appearance in the 2016 presidential race as Republican nominee Donald Trump and his supporters cast frequent aspersions on the press for allegedly favoring his opponent Hillary Clinton. All right, it's we'll get into this too, folks, about how supposedly Hillary robbed the spotlight from the Don. Its purveyors typically display confidence that is brash, even by the standards of political rhetoric. Goldberg's remark that the media's liberal slant is so blatantly true. All right, this is Bernard Goldberg now, former CBS guy, wrote this book on bias in the media. All right, he's being quoted here. Goldberg's remark was that the media's liberal slant is so blatantly true that it's hardly worth discussing anymore. Aptly summarizes the view of many attentive conservatives and switching liberal slant to conservative slant, an increasing number of attentive liberals. But, Schiffer asked, is it really so true? Is it really so true that it isn't worth discussing? All right? Is it that true that it's not worth some reasonable debate in regards to this thing? For the matter, is it true at all? Is it true at all? We'll find out. For all the bluster in popular discourse, the question has proven difficult to answer. All right? Those who insist that the press is liberal do so without compelling logic or evidence. All right? While scholars who attempt to measure and characterize partisan bias paint an inconclusive, caveat-laden picture. All right? So, and here's a cover of here's the audiobook version. I couldn't find it right of Bernard Goldberg's book. It wasn't the beginning of this thing. The beginning goes back a little further back in history. All right, but Bernard Goldberg, a CBS insider, who left CBS, and was disgruntled due to this conception he had of liberal bias. All right. Back to kind of riffing. Schiffer will go back and riff on this Al Franken quote about the fact that, it's we shouldn't be concerned about how much oil is in Al-Qaeda using in their hummus, as opposed to the fact that the more important issue is they're trying to kill us. All right. While the media aren't literally trying, and this is a big takeaway, folks, and it has to do with, and we've already talked a lot about this, the founding of the press, the founding of what constituted journalism, not only in this country but abroad. What was its initial goals? Why did governments invest in it? And why did the U.S. Constitution have this idea of freedom of the press as the very, very first amendment? Not the 14th, not the 68th, the very, very first amendment. What was it about the press that made it so darn important that it became this whole freedom of the press became so important? We have to go back and revisit and operationalize some of the reasons why the press, some of the goals of the press, some of the duties that the press was supposed to, and the mission statement of what the press was supposed to be about, and why the founding fathers of our government put such emphasis on this idea that if a democracy was going to function, they were caught up in this idea of democracy, of this government. Because remember, they had just come out of a situation where a couple, three people, and their surrounding people were telling everybody what to do. A very, very small amount of people were dictating to the rest of the people how they were going to live and what they were going to say and what they were going to be allowed to do and how much money they were going to make and this and that and the other thing, all right? They had come out of that situation. They did not like that situation. They started reading all of these philosophers of their day that started to make proposals about some alternative situations in which the majority of this kind of, one of the predicating ideas was that the majority of the people should be treated respectfully and treat each other equally, as opposed to the guys up on the castle kind of deciding, what you were going to do and what you weren't going to do. That everybody should, that there was this whole idea that had these kind of quasi-religious overtones, but, it kind of works in a humanist framework, too. That everybody was kind of equal. That we were all equal in one way or another. Yeah, it's like this guy was smarter than this guy, or this guy was, better looking, or this guy, could run faster on the track field. But for all intents and purposes, we all had, our attendant skills, our attendant gifts, our attendant defects, and that's what made up, to quote Mark Twain, it's always a difference in opinion that makes up a good horse race. And these guys were sold on the idea that a republic, a nation, should be one in which the individual was respected. All right, that each individual would have a say in the decision-making process of how things were run. All right, and they were enamored by this idea. All right, so much so that they felt that in order for this whole democratic process of elections, of town meetings, of taxes, of the public good, needed to, in order for that organization to function democratically, people needed to be what? People needed to be well informed. People needed to be well informed on what was going on, all right? So there were two main mission statements of journalism. One was to serve as a kind of public, like the way public service announcements serve now, to kind of act at the behest of the public to let them know, what was going on, whether it be in government or science or agriculture or medicine, in order for them to make informed decisions about how they were going to live their lives. All right, democracy. This was this idea. Comes from the Greek demos, or the people, run by the people. All right, it wasn't a totally revolutionary idea, but it hadn't been tried in a while. The last time it had actually been tried would be like a couple millennia earlier in Periclean Greece. All right, this whole idea of the demo, hence it comes from, the demos. That had been the last shot at this democratic thing. So these guys got together and said, let's do this, let's try this again. Because it seems to make sense. And it seems to be ethical. And it seems to there seems to be some integrity to this idea that kind of coincide. And remember, most of these men were Christian, of some Christian faith. Hence, this kind of quasi religious idea, going back to the Bible and reading back through the New Testament and saying, hey, the guy that we go to, it's like whether you're Protestant, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Methodist, whether you're Anglican, whether you're Seventh-day Adventist, whatever. It's like this guy that we go and listen to, this guy who's the main guy in this book that resides in this place that we go to every Sunday, seem to have a few ideas about how to treat other people that perhaps, if we're not going to be total hypocrites, maybe some of the things that this guy said, do you remember the guy that we go and listen to about every Sunday? Maybe we should incorporate some of those overarching ethical ideas about how people should be treated into our government. Into our government. It was like, who would have thought? They would take that route, but they didn't. All right. Going back to the takeaway with Schiffer. While the media aren't literally trying to kill us, they sometimes inflict serious injury on informed citizenship. Serious injury on informed citizenship. Let's go back to the Founding Fathers. The only way a healthy democracy was going to operate is that if a democracy can only be as good as the citizens that make up that democracy. And if they are uninformed, or they are fed bullshit, or fake news, or propaganda, all right, they suffer, the whole thing suffers, all right? So that this whole idea of a healthy, functioning political system being predicated on an informed citizenry made a lot of sense to them, all right? Up to the point where they wanted to really kind of put some protections into place to make sure that the citizenry, were informed. Back to this. While the media aren't literally trying to kill us, they sometimes inflict serious injury on informed citizenship through a litany. A litany is just a list, all right? A litany of routines, biases, and shortcomings in the media that leave news consumers, you're the consumer, I'm the consumer. If you're watching the news, if you're buying a newspaper, if you're going to a website, you're a consumer, all right? That leave news consumers ill-equipped to navigate contemporary politics, all right? Let me read that again. While the media aren't literally trying to kill us, they sometimes inflict serious injury on informed citizenship through a litany of routines, biases, and shortcomings that leave news consumers ill-equipped to navigate contemporary politics, all right? Ill-equipped to navigate the realities, not the propaganda, not the fake news, not the tweets, but to be able to navigate the political realities that they live in, that they wake up to and they find themselves in every day. All right? To name only a few of these biases, shortcomings, and routines. Let's name a couple, Professor Schiffer says. To name only a few. News coverage of politics focuses on the strategic game and the personalities at the center of political conflicts rather than the underlying policy issues. focuses on the strategic game, the strategies, who did what to whom, and the personalities. What this guy did, what this guy said, what this guy said about this guy's kid, what this other guy said about this guy having a mistress, all of that, all of the drama, all right, that elected officials, you would think that they would, you elect these guys, they make a lot of money, you would think that they would take the job seriously, all right? Take it seriously enough that the comments that they were making would be about facts, all right, and actual policies as opposed to strategies. But that the media, being an amplifier of this, and being a gatekeeper, and we'll talk about this whole idea of the gatekeeper, being the gatekeeper of this, will kind of fall into step. And if any of you have ever had a parrot or a myna bird, they have a tendency. Some of them are really, really good at mimicking what you say. Hence the media sometimes has a tendency to kind of be a parrot. A parrot. To name only a few, news coverage of politics focuses on the strategic game and the personalities at the center of political conflicts rather than the underlying policy issues. What are the issues? What are they really? All right? About spending. About money that is going to schools. All right? About ways of dealing with people being thrown out of their homes. About national defense and where the money is going, all right? About your streets, about the quality of your air, about the quality of the food that you go to the store and buy. All of these real concrete things that affect your day-to-day quality of life, all right, that are basically the end result of policy decisions. Decisions about, what to do with tax money, and such. It presents events as isolated, all right? It presents events as isolated episodes rather than in any meaningful social, economic, political context. It gives us episodes. We read the Times. We watch CBS News. We watch TV 12. Boom, this is happening. Boom, that happened. Boom, there was this killing. All right? Boom, something else happened. But linking these things to wider social and societal overarching processes is not something that it's something that it's not necessarily a question of whether it's good at it or not, because to say that it's good at it, to say that the mainstream media is either good or bad at providing context would be predicated on the idea that they were even doing it in any way at all, that they were providing any kind of context at all, which they generally don't. It fails to adjudicate. What does adjudicate mean? We'll get to that. It fails to adjudicate the veracity of politically loaded factual questions. All right? It needs to do its fact checking. One of the things that, and I'm sure that Mr. Kelly, when we have that conversation with him, we'll talk about how he's got to check his facts as a journalist. Same thing with Dr. Schiffer. He's going to have to check his facts, all right, as opposed to just kind of putting whatever somebody says out there, right? So this whole idea of adjudicating or verifying the veracity, the truth value of politically loaded factual questions, and it privileges, once again, the media, it privileges events that are dramatic, scandalous, simple, things that Joe Sixpack can understand, all right? Scandals, drama. It's like watch like shows like Entertainment Tonight, which are just a glorified version of the mainstream media, what the mainstream media does anyway, right? The cult of celebrity, who's dating who did this to who said this, who made a racist comment, who didn't. Likes to break things down into simple, novel, anything that's novel, right? Oh, we got to do something. It's like, well, this is a horse of things, oddities, like the freak show at the carnival back in the days. It has to keep you like distracted with freaky things and dumb memes and stuff like that, right? Things that are novel or timely, right? So up to the minute. It's got to be timely, It's like we don't want to. It's like we don't want to hear stories about history. We don't want to hear stories about context. All right, and emotional over more important events that do not meet those criteria. All right. In short, the press is a mess. This is Schiffer. The press is a mess, my friends, and not because of political slant. What is he going to attempt to say in this chapter? He is going to say that instead one of his main contentions in this chapter and in the entire book as such will be that we should probably concern ourselves more with the actual structural failures and defects of journalism as an enterprise, as opposed to this kind of which way it's slanted, which is a kind of secondary qualitative aspersion that really doesn't have to do with calling out some of the glaring inequities of what passes for mainstream journalism. And we've already talked about why some of that stuff gets generated. Whether it be due to forming some kind of consensus idea about stuff, selling you on an idea, selling you on what's normal, selling you, on, certain ideas like that the economy is going just great, or everyone's safe, whatever. But he says the press is a mess, and it's not because of political slant. That's on page 2. And then he'll go on and explain like the actual modus vivendi of the book. Why did he write this book? This book argues that too many citizens and critics are looking for bias charges in the wrong places. We shouldn't be thinking in terms of left and right biases, but other larger overarching biases about what mainstream media chooses to report and what it chooses not to report. Chooses what the value system that it has come up with in order to decide what's going to be on page 1. This whole overarching system of ideas concerning what kind of material is going to be on page 1, what's going to be inside, what's going to be on the back page, and how much import that we afford certain ideas, all right, that we should be looking for, all right, and whether the mainstream media are free enough from corporate interest that they are able to tell the truth, right? And what we really need to know, as part of this democratic informed citizenry thing, to have this enterprise, which is called the Fourth Estate, all right? The Fourth Estate, news was called the Fourth Estate due to the idea that along with the executive, judicial, and legislative branches, one should almost have treated it like another arm of the government, right? The watchdog arm, the arm that reported on things, the arm that kept things transparent, the arm that spoke truth to power when things were awry, and called the powerful on their shit. All right, that was supposed to be the role of the media. The media wasn't there to get bought off and cover that stuff out. It was supposed to inform you of when somebody that you went down to the local Kiwanis or the Elks Club and threw a lever for, when that guy took the money that came out of your paycheck and put it in his pocket. All right? And let you know that that guy did that. The guy that you threw the ballot for, who said he was going to like take that money and do this and that and the other thing with it, but instead he put it in his pocket. That was the kind of thing the press was supposed to let you know about. So the next time that came around, you would think twice about pulling the ballot. Either two things would happen. One, that guy would go to jail, or two, you would think twice about pulling the ballot for that guy. Because the media, acting freely, felt that you had a vested interest in knowing the goings-ons of what the government was doing. All right? So, specifically, the argument that Schiffer wants to make unfolds in two parts. One, partisan bias tends to be flawed. The charges tend to be flawed. He'll explain why they're flawed. Two, citizens should be more concerned with other types of media bias, not unlike the ones I just talked about. What's being reported, how it's being reported, how it actually affects you, the things that as an informed citizen you should know about. All right, to protect your welfare, to protect the welfare of your family, all right, and to be able to make the right decisions, when it comes to, navigating through life. For instance, back in the day, there's always been like situations, for instance, like a guy by the name of Ralph Nader became one of the first of what was called consumer advocates, all right? In this whole industrial manufacturing process, there were a lot of things that were being made in the early stages of the game, whether in the automotive industry or other things like paint, like things that they were using to build houses with, that were not very good for you and were not safe. And guys like Nader came along, and for instance, there was a car that had been built. It was called the Corvair. And I can't remember who designed it. I think it was a GM car. Don't quote me on this. But his first book was called Unsafe at Any Speed. And he did a report on the fact that this car that was being mass manufactured, what was happening was that it was structurally unsound, and when people were getting into accidents with this car, they were dying in numbers far above any other car. That they were just not safe, and so he reported on it. He said, hey, don't buy this car. You're going to die in this thing, all right? Hence, this whole idea of consumer awareness starts to spring up, all right? And the same thing with things like paint, for a long period of time. The paint, and there's some really interesting books on that too. All right, like the paint industry was using paint that had lead in it. All right, lead-based paint. What they came to find out was that lead was bad for you, and that kids and in the most extreme form, they were finding that kids had a tendency to chew on lead paint, and it could lead to mental disablement, and all kinds of like heinous things. All right, so this whole idea of like knowing like what's in the stuff that you buy, that's part of journalism. That's part of journalism. Consumer awareness. public safety. When something is not safe, journalists go out and they do the research and they go toe to toe. And what do corporations do on the other end of it? The corporations, all right, seldom has a corporation, in fact, usually never, does a corporation, let's take the tobacco industry for instance, all right? The tobacco industry that was making billions of dollars, and surgeons and researchers were starting to find out that, oh, wait a minute, it's like people are smoking these things and it's killing them. It's killing them in droves, all right? Well, it's like, one would think that, it's like, being like good corporate citizens, the tobacco industry would have stepped up and said, you know what? You're absolutely right. These things are killing people and we should just take them off the market. But no, my friends, no. Herein lies the tale. Herein lies the tale of the vicious propaganda, public relations battles that go on between the manufacturers of unhealthy things like lead paint or PVC or vinyl chloride or tobacco or whatever. This is the point where the industry starts to play these games in order to defend itself and try to disprove the scientists. Like, no, it's like, and then they go as far as doing things like getting their own scientists who they pay off like this, and they say, listen, it's like, do a study that, it's like, these guys over at Harvard, all right, and John Hopkins and Cambridge, these guys, these medical guys, they did all these studies, all this scholarly stuff to prove that tobacco causes lung cancer. It's like we will pay you a lot of money to go and do studies to kind of minimize the effects and say, well, it's inconclusive. It's kind of like the climate change thing. How like, certain people had an interest, let's say like, anybody that was manufacturing anything with a carbon footprint had a vested interest in paying off their own scientists to go, hey, we will give you this much money to go and minimize these findings. And money talks, folks. That's what it does. Money talks, and it becomes a question of like how these people sleep at night, who knows? Probably with a lot of Ambien or alcohol in order for them to sleep at night with a clear conscience. So there's that. There's all that. So this endurance. So Schiffer looks at this enduring charge. All right, he calls it an enduring charge. He says the liberal bias charge appears to be as widely believed as ever. All right, writing in 2014, not too long ago. This is before Trump gets elected the first time around. All right, the Pew Research Center, a reputable research center, for those of you that want to do a little bit of Googling, has asked survey respondents about media bias intermittently since 1985. And the numbers have risen steadily. The percentage of people, the Pew Research Survey question, agreed that news organizations, quote, tend to favor one side. It was 53 in 1985, 67% in 1997, and a record high 77% in the most recent survey of 2011. They also asked whether news organizations are, quote, politically biased, with the results broken down by party, all right? Among Republicans, 49% agreed in 1985, 69% in 2002, and 76% in 2011. Just off the record, 78%. Just off the record, 78% in 2009. There seems to have been a little bit of a dip between 02 and 09. Presumably, they mostly perceived liberal bias, all right? This was when Republicans and conservatives were surveyed. On the other hand, interestingly enough, Democratic perceptions of bias are increasing as well, but not as at the same rates. but not as steeply. 43% in 1985, 54% in 2011. Independents have increased from 44% to 63% over the same time frame. So that there is this rising, on both sides of the aisle, belief that politics is biased. Or rather, the media is biased. I'm sorry. Sorry for this slide, too. I was trying to frame grab this thing and it just turned into this mess. Schiffer goes on. Today, however, the media landscape is vastly altered from a generation ago. Not only are there more outlets providing political information, more outlets, more views, supposedly more diversity, from an increasing variety of platforms. Remember, it's all kind of blowing open. We've already kind of gone through this. Independent news, bloggers, different sites like Politico, or different like SCOTUS, the Supreme Court blog. We've talked about this. The landscape is changing. A lot of other different sources of news, right? So the media landscape is vastly altered from a generation ago. Not only are there more outlets providing political information from an increasing variety of platforms, but the content is far more varied as well. If the old guard media fail to cover an event or statement that is potentially damaging to one side, someone else with different judgment will surely pick it up. The whole idea of a difference in opinion, right? This should theoretically dull the urgency of the liberal bias charge. All right? If there's more people out there to counter, if there's more sources of information to contest this supposed liberal media, then the charges of there being this, monolithic, overwhelming, consensual, liberal tendency in the media, one would think that with more outlets that becomes more contested, and the idea of political bias becomes more contestable. Yet it hasn't. It continues. This liberal media charge continues, even in the view of all these other outlets, right? Thus, Schiffer says, to solve this puzzle and begin to grasp why the charge is louder than ever, its origins and role in contemporary politics must be understood. The charge's prominence and persistence are a function of several disparate factors. All right? He's going to explain to us why, given the fact that there's more outlets than ever, that this charge still continues to kind of hold in the public imaginary. The public, in the thing. All right? Woven through all of them is a crucial insight. Above all, the liberal bias charge is a strategic talking point. We have to understand, and we're going to start to understand, what is meant. Bongiorno just broke his pencil. What is meant by a strategic talking point, all right? And what it means, all right? But keep it in mind and write it down for now. And if you haven't read it, you're going to have to start reading, all right? Strategic talking points. Also known as working the ref, all right? Let's look at this. The mainstream media tilt to the left, all right, that idea that the mainstream media tilt to the left sits alongside other Republican Party or conservative movement beliefs. It is a belief, all right? It's a talking point. It's something that, we'll find out, like conservative radio talk show hosts and conservative media or pundits on things like Fox News or whatever tend to level this charge, all right, as an idea, all right, the way that people talk about whether the sun comes up in the morning or not. It becomes a truism. It becomes one of these taken for granted that becomes a talking point, All right. It sits alongside other Republican Party or conservative movement beliefs, such as, quote, tax cuts create growth. All right. Tax cuts create growth. Or life begins at conception. Talking points. All right. Things that within a certain discourse, within a certain language game of discussion, become these uncontestable things. All right. We just kind of take them with this kind of knee-jerk reflex. Well, it's like, well, of course tax cuts create job growth. Well, of course life begins at conception. You know, this kind of commonsensical, the way it kind of turns into, it's like, if you don't believe in this, then what do you think? Or heavy regulation is bad for business. Another conservative talking point, right? Do they ever get into, do they ever provide the data? Do they ever do the research? Sometimes. More often than not, no. All right? And the arsenal of talking points employed by partisan communicators in campaign books and commentary. This whole idea of the liberal media becomes a talking point. All right? A factoid. All right? Kind of like a meme. All right? Think of it as kind of like a meme of truth that a meme that everybody agrees is true. Like, well, it's true. You know, it would be the same thing as saying, you know, if enough people said, for instance, if you got enough people to say that the moon was made out of green cheese, if you got enough people saying it, you know, it becomes true. All right? It's like, you know, as opposed to sending somebody up there, you know, and digging some samples and trying to eat it and saying, wait a minute, this is like, no, it's not green cheese, all right? So it's kind of like the green cheese thing. Accusing the press of systematically favoring the other side is a particularly attractive and effective talking point, all right? People like it. It gets them riled up, you know, when they talk about things, you know, talking points, you know. It's like when you get together with your bros and you're talking about certain things, right? There's certain things you guys talk about, certain things that are just off the subject, you know? It's like you might, with your bros or your friends, you might be talking about, like, you know, some, like, new skin on Fortnite and everybody, you know, but you're not talking about, like, Heidegger's idea of design, you know? Or you might be with your friends and you might be talking about, like, you know, the new episode of, like, Walking Dead and the talking points, all right? Things you guys talk, things that people talk about, you know, how the Giants are doing, you know, or, you know, like the latest, like, you know, talking about whether, you know, the new Cardi B single is good or trash, you know, it's like trash talking, you know, talking points, accusing the press. So for one, it allows candidates and office holders to diffuse the impact of shortcomings or controversies. Just blame the biased messenger for misreporting them. It becomes a vicious cycle, or maybe virtuous, depending on your vantage point, as persistent use of this tactic contributes to the erosion of public trust in the media. Remember, right? We're the public, all right? It's like crap rolls downhill, you know. And when our elected officials say something, we have a tendency sooner or later to start going like this, or going, probably want a cracker, you know. It's like that's what we do, you know. So this whole idea of the erosion of public trust in the media, which in turn makes the press more vulnerable to, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now it's like the press becomes more vulnerable to the attack as perception of bias becomes a core belief of partisans. The talking point also serves as a reliable applause line to rally the troops. Rallying up the troops during the rally, folks. You know, whether you're wearing masks or not. Gotta say some things out there to get people to start going, Yahoo! You know? or whatever. You know, gotta get them all riled up. You know, saying little things. You know, that may or may not be based on any kind of like depth or context or facts, right? Got to serve as a reliable applause line to rally the troops during a speech or a debate. As detailed in Chapter 6, and we'll get to it, one of the candidates' debates during the 2015-2016 Republican nomination contest featured several bias charges that reverberated in the National Political Convention for weeks. All right, so this whole idea of political bias. All right, the talking point serves an additional function, and this is an interesting metaphor. What writer Eric Alterman called, quote, working the refs, all right? Any of you that play sports or watch sports know exactly what he's talking about here about working the refs. What do coaches do, okay? Every basketball fan knows that coaches levy frequent bias accusations against the referees. They call it a home job. They call it whatever, right? But the ref is making calls in favor of the other team, right? Often delivered in profanity-laced shouts that can last for minutes at a time. when they perceive a call or its lack to have favored the other team. Some prominent coaches, like Duke University's men's coach Mike Krzyzewski, do this incessantly as a key component of their coaching strategy. Working the refs as their coaching strategy. While it may appear on the surface as understandable, venting in response to perceived injustice, right? A lot of times it's a normal response. It's like, you know, ref made a bad call, you kind of get mad, right? But what they're saying here is something different. While it may appear on the surface as understandable, venting in response to a perceived injustice, the deeper purpose is to convince the referees to watch for the other team's wrongdoing more diligently, as well as to think twice about blowing the whistle against the biased Chargers team, right? Working the refs, right? Accusing them of bias and kind of conditioning them, you know, to be like, well, I don't want to, like, you know, make him mad again. I better start looking at the other team, right? So, working the refs not only undermines the credibility of the refs to team partisans, but it may also move the refs, even if subtly or subconsciously, in the team's direction. Indeed, opponents have complained for years that Duke receives a disproportionate share of favorable calls. All right? Working the refs, all right? The mainstream media, okay, so we've got that. While its status, once again, we get back to like its what this, like, you know, charge of like the liberal media, what its status is, right? While its status as a strategic talking point is indispensable to understanding the charge, the talking point wasn't created out of the whole cloth and disseminated by luck or by fluke, all right? This didn't come into the public discourse without an incubation process, without certain forces and powers that were afoot wanting to turn this thing into a thing, all right? It didn't just kind of come out of thin air, right? One, it arose from an ideological movement. It came out of a movement, historically. Two, it gained plausibility through particular incidents, which we will talk about. And number three, it is amplified through commentary channels, right? So we have three different stages of this. Comes out of an ideological movement, gains plausibility through certain incidents, finding things to, like, say, well, there you go, and being amplified over and over again through those channels of the media that disseminate this kind of idea. All right? Only in tandem with these three factors does the talking point insight shed light on the charge's rise and the charge's persistence. All right? This came from somewhere. This came from somewhere. We have to understand where it came from. And we have to go through the facts. Where did it come from? We'll talk about this more in the next lecture. But it came from what is now historically called the conservative movement. We have to understand where this conservative movement, this political, ideological conservative movement, where it started, and it started and it started in the 1940s and 50s, and what it was a response to. All right? We need to talk about this rising up of this conservative movement and how it came to ascendancy and power throughout the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, all right? Because it wasn't always a thing, all right? Through criticism of the political tenor of news, let me repeat myself. Though criticism of the political tenor of news is as old as the printing press, the concept of partisan bias against a news outlet only makes sense if the outlet aspires to be neutral between the two sides of the American political divide. As such, the liberal bias charge could, theoretically, only date back as far as the early 20th century, when newspapers imported the mantle of objectivity from the sciences. What is he trying to say here? Newspapers, by the early 20th century, we talked about this. We talked about this with the history of newspapers. How they went and kind of cleaned up their act after the yellow journalism period of the sensational robber barons like the Hearst and the Pulitzers, right? They went back and they said, we should do something, we should make this more objective. We should clean up our act, right? So this whole idea of objectivity starts in the beginning of the 20th century by the newspaper industry in order to kind of like clean up its act and hold itself to a higher standard, right? When newspapers, so from the side, and adopted routines, so then they adopted routines and practices meant to communicate neutrality to their audiences. Then it became about, well, we need to be fair and balanced. We need to be objective. We need to aspire to these ideas, all right, that kind of are in response to what we just came out of, all right. In fact, the contemporary liberal bias charge arose out of the disconnect between news output and a changing political landscape during the tumultuous 1960s. It will come to a head in the 1960s. All right. I wanted to get a lot more into this. I think that it will be best to get into it on Tuesday so that you will be able to respond to it, because I think that what Schiffer has to say in the second part of chapter 1 and bringing in the facts and bringing in the history and bringing in the data will shed a whole new light on the things that are going on currently in our highly polarized, divided nation about this election. I think that we're going to find that a lot of the things that Adam Schiffer says in this book are the main causes of why this current election is a shit show. All right? And we'll get into it on Tuesday. Don't forget those media scans. Don't forget to comment on those media scans. And don't forget to read Adam Schiffer, and I'll get more of the book up by this week. So have a good night, guys.